All right, we're going to go ahead on and get started. I want to thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Adrian Dixon. I serve as the pastor here at Northside, and we're very honored that you would be here tonight. I'm not going to take much time to talk about why we're here, because we're going to get into that with the panelists. But just want to give you a couple of things tonight that will help guide our conversation. The panelists are going to introduce themselves in a few moments, and we've got some questions that I think are going to set the stage for our conversation tonight, give us a little bit of history as to why we're even having this forum and this conversation. And then towards the end of our time together, my commitment to you is that we're wrapping this up right at 8:30, but we really want to hear from you guys, and so there's going to be a time in the forum tonight where we're going to open it up for questions for the panelists. And I would tell you that there's no dumb questions when it comes to an event like this. So any questions that you have, what we're going to ask you to do, just so that everyone can hear, is if you have a question when we get to that point, to just make your way over to this microphone, speak into that so that everyone does hear the question, and that we can all hear the opportunity to respond as well. If you didn't get a chance to get any coffee on your way in, this is a very informal gathering. Please help yourself in the lobby. There's coffee, there's hot tea. If you missed the bathrooms, the women's restroom is on my right, would be your left as you walk out of this building. The men's restroom is on my left, your right, as you head out of this building. Again, thank you so much for being here. If you had told me in October of 2017 that we would be talking about human trafficking in Knightdale, I'm not sure I would have believed you. And yet here we are. So I thank you guys so much for being here tonight. We have Elizabeth Hunter, Chief Lawrence Capps, Libby Coles, and Christine Long. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with Elizabeth and just have each of the panelists introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their profession, even how they got into combating human trafficking, and then we're going to kick off our forum. Elizabeth.
Good evening. So I'm Elizabeth Hunter. I am the Project Fight Coordinator for the Salvation Army's anti-human trafficking program here in North Carolina. Project Fight stands for Freeing Individuals Gripped by Human Trafficking. I guess so we provide comprehensive case management services, just so you know a little bit about Project Fight specifically. We work with all victims of human trafficking, male, female, sex and labor trafficking, minors and adults, domestic and foreign-born. So we serve all populations in the entire state of North Carolina. And I guess a little bit about how I got into this profession. It was kind of an accident, to be honest with you. It happened, I needed to move to North Carolina, and I grew up in the Salvation Army. My parents were pastors in the Salvation Army, and so the Salvation Army has always been at my heart, their mission and their values. And so this position came open, and I just kind of felt like it had to be right. It closed its door once on me, and then it reopened, and God doesn't always do that by accident. So I just followed his calling, and here I am, and 2 years later, I'm still here. so yeah, that's right, I'm here to stay. So that's just a little bit about me. I don't think I need to go much more.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lawrence Capps. I'm the police chief here in Knightdale. I have had the privilege of serving in this role now for a little over 4 years. Just starting my 20th year in law enforcement. It has been quite a journey, to say the least. It is a calling. It is something that I am strongly passionate about. It is something that is very much a part of me at this point in my life. As Adrian said a few moments ago, if you'd told me a couple of years ago that we'd be talking about human trafficking here in Knightdale, I don't know that I could have quite wrapped my mind around that. It is a growing issue and concern in the law enforcement community. It is something that we have read a lot of articles about. We've seen a lot of information. There's a lot of training available out there, but when you think about your community, when you think about the population and the jurisdiction that you serve, and knowing what I knew about Knightdale up until that time, it was not something that I thought we would be dealing with. But again, here we are having this conversation. And so we're looking forward to contributing from a law enforcement standpoint this evening. And like all good police officers, I brought some backup, and I'm going to take an opportunity to allow Detective Sergeant Pete Smith, who was the lead investigator on the cases that we had here in Knightdale a couple of years ago, introduce himself, and I will probably defer to him on a couple of questions. I think he's going to be able to offer some tremendous insight, just to kind of give you a little bit of background on the cases when that time comes. Thanks, Pete.
Good evening. I'm Detective Sergeant Smith of the Knightdale Police Department. you, Pastor Adrian, for having us tonight. Appreciate that very much. As Chief Cap said, I was the lead investigator on these cases that we undertook a couple years ago. And as he said, if we're going to talk about human trafficking a couple years ago, I'd have never believed it. And I didn't believe it going into those cases, but it reared its ugly head, and we had to deal with it accordingly. So thank you again for having us tonight.
Good evening. I'm Libby Coles. I am Executive Director of Justice Matters, and we are a nonprofit service provider here in North Carolina. We address the roots and repercussions of human trafficking by providing trauma-informed legal services, both services that prevent human trafficking and then services that help survivors rebuild their lives. And we address human trafficking at a systemic level through training and advocacy. And as part of that, I chair the state's Human Trafficking Commission. And I actually learned about human trafficking here in North Carolina while I was working for Russell Killen at Parker Poe. And it was through Christine Long here, who was with Salvation Army at that time. So very grateful to you for opening my eyes.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Christine Long. I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. The commission is legislatively mandated and was created in 2012 to help North Carolina plan strategically how to handle and increase our ability to respond to human trafficking. And so it's been a great pleasure to be in this role. Prior to that, I learned about human trafficking at the Salvation Army here in Wake County, and I was there for a long number of years as their program director of all of their programs that they had. And so I actually had been sent out on disaster work after Hurricane Katrina, and I met a number of individuals that were also part of this movement in North Carolina to try to help motivate and bring awareness to North Carolina. And I just got brought into it that way, and then through the Salvation Army was able to kind of keep on that pattern. So,
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you.
So maybe what would help is to set the stage for us. Take us back to maybe November 2017, the different roles that you guys played and what led to this event happening or being discovered in our community.
Sure, so I think that question is automatically going to default to us. I'll say this, that if you remember reading anything in the press release and my statements following the event, you will probably recall that we had been receiving complaints about some unusual activity in a couple of locations here in Knightdale for the better part of 2 years. And as with all of those types of complaints, our initial approach was to try to treat it as we would any sort of complaint related to potential prostitution. And so we initiated efforts very early on to try to see if we could determine that there was in fact something going on in these establishments. And those efforts weren't very productive. And it wasn't until fast forward a couple of years, it wasn't until we started receiving some more specific information about what was going on that said, wait a minute, we may not be dealing with just your and I hate to use this word, your typical type of prostitution activity. And so at that point in time is when Detective Sergeant Pete Smith began to look into the cases. And as a subject matter expert, I think it would be appropriate for Pete to give us an overview of kind of where we went from there, and as I said, provide you with a little bit of a recap on how that investigation went.
Well, as the Chief Cap says, we were receiving some citizen complaints, and we actually got some complaints from some business owners as well that saw these businesses as kind of suspicious, partly due to their hours. They're open 7 days a week, sometimes open until 11 o'clock at night, sometimes later, depending on the amount of folks that were coming through the front door, which alarmed some of the business owners in the area and adjacent businesses and things like that. In addition, we had one woman who owns a legitimate massage parlor in Raleigh, who's a resident of Knightdale, see these businesses as unlicensed and therefore illicit. In North Carolina, you have to be a licensed massage therapist in order to perform massages in this state. And unfortunately, these businesses did not have any licensed massage therapists in them. When they were first chartered, first set up through the zoning committee and things like that, they used a licensed individual that was setting up businesses all over North Carolina with the same license. So initially, when they were first started doing business here in Knightdale, they were legitimate. as far as we could tell. As Chief Capps alluded to, we did do some investigative work that didn't bear any fruit. Therefore, we did our due diligence and looked into it and didn't see anything against the law or in violation of those things. At that time, we weren't as versed as we are now on this situation. In the coming months, we met with a subject matter expert that was hired by the licensing board for the North Carolina Massage Therapy Board, and he's a retired Raleigh police captain, I believe, and was doing private investigative work. He opened our eyes to a lot of things that was going on inside these businesses that we had no idea was happening. And across the state, it's no one just here. It's in Raleigh, it's in Cary, it's in Apex, it's in Cherokee, it's in Boone, it's all across the country, matter of fact. Like Miss Christine said, back in 2012, and Miss Libby as well, the word human trafficking started becoming more prominent in North Carolina. Us, as police officers, were getting some mandated in-service training to kind of tell us about it and what's going on with it. But we just kind of took it as, as training, but we really weren't seeing it in our communities at the time. So North Carolina has mandated even some more things, including the Human Trafficking Commission. And we are finally up to speed, I believe, with the rest of the country and maybe even ahead of some other states now. There for a while, I believe they all agree we were kind of behind the curve on this. I think it started out on the west coast and worked its way this way, especially down in the southeast, and then came up this way and kind of met in the middle. Most of this stuff is based out of New York, and Flushing, New York, for Flushing, Queens, if anybody's familiar with that area. And I'm sure Ms. Elizabeth can kind of give you some more details on that if you have any questions. But back in 2016, we kind of got some more complaints and started really taking a look into this. And like I said, we got educated on what's going on there. So we started our investigative efforts we did surveillance. We talked to folks that were coming out of the businesses, and we quickly learned that what we believed was going on inside there was actually going on inside there, and more. So things above and beyond massages were going on. Of course, they were illicit massage parlors because the folks doing the massages weren't licensed. It was a cash business. There was a few credit card machines, but primarily cash business. And like I said, they're open from 9 a.m. in the morning till 10, 11 o'clock at night, 7 days a week. Some of the business owners nearby said, folks came in and out a lot throughout the day, just one after another after another. So it kind of, I saw this doing surveillance. Some of my team members saw this doing surveillance, and we decided to launch an undercover investigation where we actually sent somebody inside on an undercover basis. And lo and behold, the inside was just like we were told it was going to be. There were young women, even middle-aged women, Chinese nationals primarily, that were living in these establishments. They had their bags packed in rooms. They had little kitchenettes in there. They were taking showers on a table. And they conducted 24 hours a day. They lived inside these businesses right here in town. They had New York driver's license, New York identification cards, and nothing more. A few $100s in their pocket, and that's about it. Most of them had some sort of transportation documents in their luggage where they came down from New York on a bus line primarily. So once we kind of got our foot in the door, so to speak, we consulted with our district attorney's office and kind of got their thoughts on things. We partnered with several agencies across the state that had a little bit more experience in this than we did. And I quickly kind of got the dump truck effect when learning about this and how to investigate these things properly and which I's to dot and which T's to cross. So we partnered with Alcohol Law Enforcement, Homeland Security, Fayetteville Police Department, Raleigh Police Department, Apex Police Department. So some of these other agencies have had a little bit of a history with this stuff I kind of went to them and said, how'd you guys do it? How'd you put together your case? Can I see your case file? And they gave me some tips and pointers, and I kind of took the best of what everybody had to offer and tried to employ that here in Knightdale. We were able to conduct search warrants at 3 locations throughout a couple months span there. And prior to getting into these search warrants, once we established probable cause, we reached out to the folks at Project Fight and Ms. Libby's folks to come help out these victims. We took a victim-centered approach to this because we knew these ladies weren't here completely voluntarily. We knew there was some circumstance in their life that caused them to come here and live in a business 24 hours a day, take a shower on a table, wash their clothes in a bowl, and eat out of a microwave in a hot plate. So we had these folks with us at our briefing that morning, and we had 25 other folks from multiple agencies across the state, like I said, Homeland Security, ALE, SBI was there, Raleigh PD was very helpful with us that day, and we executed 3 search warrants simultaneously, 2 at businesses and 1 at a residence in Holly Springs. And when we went in, we found just what we thought we were going to find, cash money business, no licensing, women that were there who had a bag of clothes and nothing more. And these women were pulled out and taken to the folks at Project Fight for consultation, and Ms. Libby's folks as well, to try and get them some resources. And we did that with each and every establishment that we did this at. We were able to identify one woman as a kind of a, I don't want to use the word kingpin, but she was very instrumental in her business on a daily basis. And we were able to charge her with human trafficking of an adult victim, along with promotion of prostitution, because she was advertising this business online as a prostitution business. So we were able to charge her with a number of those crimes, and that case is still pending, so I can't really talk about it too much. But the other folks, we found out that once we got in there and started looking at the documentation, that these businesses were linked to other businesses throughout the state and into other states, Myrtle Beach, Fayetteville, Greensboro, Burlington, Winston-Salem. So there's a network of folks that were involved in this. And again, everything kind of goes back to Queens, New York. That's where kind of I guess the head of the syndicate or criminal enterprise is. A lot of these folks had their banking done through there. The deposit slips that they would deposit on a daily basis or weekly basis all had Flushing addresses. All this intel was gathered up and is still under review by the FBI, IRS, Homeland Security. Like I said, when we found out they were connected to other businesses throughout the state, we were able to partner with those agencies as well. So we were able to shut down a great number of these massage parlors throughout the state in pretty short order once we kind of got our feet wet and kind of figured out what was going on. Of course, they still pop up from time to time, but we're more well-armed now. We kind of know what to expect and how to go about it. They're getting a little bit more savvy. They're changing their ways so that they don't stick out as bad as they used to. But we're changing as well. Our intel is getting better as well. So that's it in a nutshell. And if you guys have any specific questions, I'll be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Pete.
So maybe a follow-up to that is I think it would be helpful to hear maybe a definition on human trafficking. What exactly is it, and how do victims get pulled into that or get forced into that?
Before we jump to that,
Yeah.
I just want to say, Knightdale Police Department, you are a model for the rest of the state. I just thank you for doing the hard work of taking the victim-centered approach that you did. Not everyone does that. Not everyone finds it easy to collaborate with Elizabeth and her folks and me and my team of lawyers, but just speaking on behalf of my team, we were so grateful to have the opportunity to meet with those women and advise them of their legal rights and the fact that they were eligible for a visa so that they could work with you as you investigated and prosecuted the crime, and they could put their life back together in safety here in the U.S. So thank you.
Yeah.
So the question was, what is, I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna say,
Did I
do you
step
want
on
to,
top of
no,
it?
you're good to define it.
So-
You know better
And then
than
I'll
me.
read the statute.
Yeah,
Just
there you
kidding.
go, there you go. Probably the best definition that I've come across is the one from Polaris. And if you are familiar with the group, I encourage you to just type it in a web browser, the Polaris Project. A tremendous amount of information regarding human trafficking and what to look for, signs, clues, how you can help. They also are looking for people who are willing to donate because it takes resources to make an impact to get this problem hopefully behind us. But the first sentence in their definition is human trafficking is the business of stealing freedom for profit. It is nothing more than modern day slavery. It is as simple as that. Now the North Carolina General Statute is a little bit more loquacious than that, if you will. It goes into a discussion about human trafficking being those individuals that are knowingly and recklessly by fraud, by force, by coercion, forcing other people into indentured servitude. As I said, it's a form of modern day slavery. And I think that at a high level, that is the definition that we need to remember and we need to let kind of sitting into our mind, because if we think of it as something else, and something that it was very important to me to mention the day that this incident kind of broke in the news. We can't afford to let ourselves think that this is a victimless crime. We can't afford to let ourselves think that it's just it's the typical type of behavior that you would see in prostitution. That's not the case. It is the theft of liberty in exchange for profit. It is modern day slavery, and the general statute does a great job of spelling out some language that's very eloquent, but that is the definition that I think citizens would do well to adopt and to remember when they hear the term human trafficking. It's modern day slavery.
Yes, so I was going to say something along the very same lines. I think the other important thing to point out is that, when you're talking about human trafficking, whether it's trafficking for the purposes of commercial sex or for labor, you have that force, fraud, and coercion there, unless it is a minor that is being induced to perform commercial sex. And then you don't need force, fraud, or coercion at all. So any minor involved in commercial sex is human trafficking.
I just wanted to poll the audience. How many of you have seen the movie Taken? Has anyone seen that?
It's getting kind of old now, isn't it?
I need to come up with a new
That's not what
example.
human trafficking looks like.
Yeah, so when you think about force, fraud, and coercion, I think our minds instantly go to kidnapping a young woman chained and being raped or beaten. But the force, fraud, and coercion can be very, very nuanced. So there could be teens in your child's school right now who are being victimized, but they're out in the community. They appear to be free. They appear to be living sort of your average teenage life, but they could be a victim. When you go to get your nails done, the folks working at the nail salon could be a victim of labor trafficking. It takes various forms. Trying to think of some good examples, the coercion, it can be psychological, it can be spiritual manipulation, debt bondage. I think in a lot of these illicit massage business cases we're seeing women are coming to the U.S. On a legal immigration visa for work purposes, and they're promised a good job so that they can send money back to their families. Who are relying on them for, to be able to survive in rural areas of that country. And then they get here, and it's not what they were told they would be able to do. But then they're caught in this situation where if they stop doing it, their family, their siblings might starve.
And what we've
I don't know if you
learned
wanna add to that.
specifically around massage parlors and illicit massage parlors is that, they've come from China over here to work, and they've probably paid a large sum of money to come to the United States to work to be able to send money back home. but the consequences if they don't work and some of that money's not made could affect their family members back home in China. So the fear even of like what could happen to that family member, even though they're not here and they're not in that situation, that a lot of times too can cause them to fear to leave their situation because they don't know what could happen. So that force and coercion part really comes in a lot of different ways. Blackmail, and even, you know, with the Chinese culture, I'm trying to think of what I'm trying to say. Sorry, it's late on Sunday night. My brain's not working. But the respect for the family and like, what am I trying to say? Do you know what I'm saying, Christine?
Yeah.
What we learned?
Yeah, what we've really learned is that in their culture, they see themselves as a group, and that they don't, you know, you don't stand out from your group, you don't speak
Right.
out from your group, you don't separate from your group, and that their whole culture is kind of centered around this group idea, mentality. And so a lot of these cases are debt bondage cases also. They're being charged for their room and their board and their food and everything, and it's this never ending, where they're not going to be able to get themselves out of debt. And so
I think it's important to note too, while here in Knightdale, we specifically in the recent past have dealt with the massage parlors, there's tons of other ways to be trafficked, right? So human trafficking, sex trafficking doesn't just happen in illicit massage parlors. It happens in hotels, it happens online, it happens at all different kinds of places, escort clubs, you know, strip clubs. It can happen anywhere. Labor trafficking can happen anywhere. Agriculture, construction, landscaping, restaurants, nail salons. So when you think of human trafficking, I don't want y'all to think it's just in massage parlors. I hope y'all don't think that. And I think that's really important to remember. So all these elements that we're talking about can go across the board to any of these different areas of trafficking. And the nuances are a little bit different. I think massage parlors are unique all in of their own. If it's just a unique, I don't even know how to, unique is the word I want to use, but it's just it is a very different form of human trafficking compared to some of the other ones that we see. So I just think it's important to note that there are lots of different forms, even though we're here talking about the massage parlor.
And a great resource, if you go online to Polaris or National Human Trafficking Resource Center, maybe if you Google Polaris or Human Trafficking Resource Center and then typologies, they recently came out with a report that goes through, I think it's 25 or 30 of some of the more common types of human trafficking that are being seen nationally. And these are based on calls into the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Human trafficking is still largely a hidden crime, so there aren't really many good statistics out there at all. But Polaris does run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and so is able to pull data from those calls. So they have great resources and stats that you can trust on their website. And I wanted to share about, just briefly about a case we have to give you a sense of how different ways human trafficking can look. We've represented several young men from various countries in Africa who were recruited to go to high school and play a sport here in the US. So someone who posed as a coach or pastor or teacher, and maybe they were, would get in touch with the family and promise them this education and world-class sports training, and they be recruited by Duke or UNC. And then the boys, the family saved up money to pay for them to get a student visa to come to the US and to pay whatever fee this person was charging for their education. The boys get over here, and sort of in the best case scenarios we've seen, they're more or less neglected. They're sitting in a house somewhere, not being fed, not being clothed, not being cared for. Maybe go to school a few times a week. Maybe get a little sports training, and then in some of the more, disturbing cases, you see the boys are actually trafficked for labor. So they are out on the streets selling magazines, raising money. If kids approach you to raise money for their basketball program, ask a few questions, dig into that. Is this really a legit program? Is this really a trip that they're going on where they do need to raise this money? Or is this a scheme where the child is raising money for someone else? So that is a type of human trafficking that has more, I guess in the past couple years, we've had some joint cases that's popped up on the radar.
So maybe that's a good segue. In addition to watching Taken, what are things that everyday people that you could say, look, notice these things, pay attention to these things. If you go in, just observe. What are the things we need to be looking out for?
I know, I think, definitely some of the, I guess, tips that Sergeant Smith gave about, businesses that you don't typically see that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, Christmas, things in your community that pop up that just seem, unusual with what you would normally see in the community. I think that any of those could be things to find out more information about. We don't typically see places with houses that have bars on them. That's not kind of the picture of human trafficking that we see most often. But it might be an apartment or a townhome where there are a lot of men coming and going very frequently, or you see an SUV pull up with a lot of girls that seem to stay there all the time, or anything like that could be a sign for human trafficking. Anytime you have a teenager that you think might be involved in any kind of commercial sex, obviously like that is human trafficking. So if I'm trying to think of more signs.
Even like at hotels, if you're in a hotel
Yeah.
and you see a lot of frequency in and out of a specific room, and for young people, I think, and in general, we always say red flags would be, having things that you can't afford. If you, all of a sudden have a child or a friend who's coming home with lots of things that they just don't normally purchase, that would be something to look at.
Signs of control. So if
Condition
you,
grooming.
yeah, initial grooming type thing, signs of control. If it's somebody that, often after I learned about human trafficking and what human trafficking really was, at that time was when I was in the Salvation Army and we had the shelter for families there. And it often presented as domestic violence. It looked like domestic violence when we later figured out that this person was under the control of a pimp or someone else. And so the control and manipulation tactics can be a sign as well.
And a lot of times victims will use a very rehearsed story because they've been trained on what to say and what not to say, so their stories can sound really rehearsed. So if you work in a medical office or in a hospital and you're interacting with a patient who has somebody with them in a room that won't leave them, they're probably going to have very scripted communication. So that's something to really look out for. And it's pretty easy to know when communication's scripted because it's not going to seem like a natural conversation. Or if they're fearful to talk and they continue to kind of look like, am I saying everything okay? That would be something to look at too.
I think it'd be important to mention as well that looking for a clustering of these things is probably your best bet. It's like anything else. You see one particular thing and you're like, okay, well, is this indicative of someone who's being forced or coerced or being enticed or recruited to do something that they wouldn't normally do, or is it innocent? Is there nothing to it? Is it just coincidence? But looking for a clustering of these things is usually a really good indicator that there's potentially something that at least warrants a follow-up, at least warrants someone asking a couple of questions. And so when you see all of the things kind of together that these ladies mentioned, when you go into that business establishment and then you can see in the back corner that there's clear evidence of someone living there, and then the people who are working behind the counters or who are attending to the customers appear to be malnourished, they appear to be in poor health. There's something about that demeanor that doesn't quite seem right. Those are a combination of things that may speak to something going on. And as I have said many, many times about many different types of activity that go on in our community, if it doesn't seem right to you, we want to know about it. It's a little cliche, but if you see something, say something. I would rather send some of my folks to go and investigate this matter for a handful of minutes, find that there's nothing to it, than for it to go unnoticed. And now we're left picking up the pieces and trying to, figure out what's going on. So again, looking for a clustering of those types of things, I think would be something that's helpful as well.
Following up on something you had shared earlier, looking at our community and just thinking something doesn't fit, how do events like this happen in communities like Knightdale? Are smaller towns, communities targeted? From what you guys have seen, is it just where there seems to be availability or a pool of people when they find interest? How does it happen in places like this?
It happens everywhere. So I don't think saying Knightdale would be a place they probably were like, this is small town, we can go here and we'll go unnoticed, would probably be how it happened.
Yeah.
It literally happens everywhere. So it happens in your wealthiest of communities, it happens in your poorest of communities, it happens in your biggest of cities and your smallest of cities. I think a trafficker probably is just looking for a population willing to purchase whatever they have to offer, right? Or willing to have the need of labor or agriculture in this state. We have a lot of labor trafficking in our state. So I think anywhere they see that they have the potential, towns with military bases are heavily populated with trafficking. Not because the military's facilitating that, but because they know that military men will purchase it. And so they go there and they provide those services. I think it's not necessarily that they're targeting where they think they'll go undetected, because I think they're too smart for that, but too dumb for that at the same time. I just think they're looking for a place where they can make money.
Yeah, and I can speak to that just a little bit. Like I said, some of these folks were seen coming in and out of businesses all day long, one after another. I saw John sitting in their car waiting for their turn because there was too many folks already in the business. So once one business sets up and they're wide open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, word gets back up to where the money's going and says, hey, they're making money in Knightdale. Let's do another business down there. Let's set up another place close by. Most of the bigger ones were in Knightdale, Cary, Apex, Fuquay, Raleigh, where you've got a large population and you've got some folks with money. So I think that's kind of what got us 3 massage parlors in Knightdale, because there was the need was there, demand was there. So.
Yeah, I think it does. It goes back to money. So experts believe that this is the second largest illicit industry in the world. So second only to the drug trade. It's a very, very lucrative industry. And the demand is there for commercial sex and cheap labor and goods.
So I've got one more question I'm going to pose to you guys, then we'll open it up. If you want to make your way up, if you have a question, you can just grab a seat over here by the detective or up here on the front row, and as soon as we wrap up this question, we'll turn it over, see if there's any in the crowd. What does the life of someone who is a victim of human trafficking, you've spoken a little bit about it. I just wonder if you could share a little bit more. What does that look like? As best you can tell, as best you've seen.
Maybe we should give an example of labor and sex trafficking.
Yeah, I guess before we do that though, I think the underlying issue is a vulnerability.
Right.
So that is the one common factor. Every victim survivor of human trafficking has some vulnerability that the trafficker is exploiting. And that can look very different if you're looking at a upper middle class teenager in suburban Northern Virginia, to some of the foreign national women that you encountered during your operation here in Knightdale. But at the end of the day, there's a vulnerability. And I don't know, well, you know what, I'll go ahead and say this now because I'm not sure if we'll come back to it, but I think that's where we as a community really hear our call to engage this issue. We have neighbors who have vulnerabilities, and the best way, I think, to combat human trafficking is to build relationship, develop relationship with our neighbors so that we can identify those vulnerabilities, come alongside them, and strengthen them so that they won't fall victim to human trafficking.
I think it'd be great to hear
Yes.
examples of. Yeah.
So I'll give an example of labor trafficking if one of y'all want to do sex trafficking. So I'm going to do labor trafficking because I am really, really passionate about labor trafficking. If you can't tell, I've mentioned it several times. It really is a hidden form of trafficking. Sex trafficking, we all think about that, right? We think of women who are trafficked and forced into sex trade. We don't think about people who are forced to perform labor in our state. And so just when you think of our state here in North Carolina, we have a lot of different areas for forced labor to happen. Our biggest is our agriculture, which I mentioned earlier. Then you think of our pork industry that we have here in the state. You think of the ports that we have along the coast. We have a lot of tourism on the coast. And then you have all the others, which would be like landscaping and construction and all those. So it really does go unnoticed because you don't think about the man painting your house possibly being trafficked. You don't think about the blueberries or the bananas or the sweet potatoes you're buying at the grocery store potentially being harvested by somebody that was trafficked. So I just kind of want to put that out there as why I really bring that up, because I think it's important to note. So for somebody that's labor trafficked, I'll just kind of give a brief overview to how it starts, because I don't think a lot of people understand that for a lot of people labor trafficked, we tend to see that to be more foreign-born clients who are coming into the state to work a lot more of the agricultural or some of the other areas I just mentioned. And they come over on a visa, an H-2A visa, and they come into the United States legally, and actually recruited by people from the United States to come into the United States and work every year during harvesting season. And so their life looks like that they work very, very long hours. A lot of times they work from early hours, 6, 7 a.m. to 7, 8 p.m. at night, sometimes longer, depending on the rapid need of that harvest to come in. They often work with very little water given to them during the day in the very, very hot sun in a field where the sun is literally beating down on you and there's no shade. They often do not have meals to eat on a very regular basis. They live in housing that I would not put my worst enemy in to live. They often, I actually visited one this summer. It was a trailer that was like an old schoolhouse trailer, and it was hot, as you know what, it was hot. I was standing in there just talking to them, and I was like dripping sweat in places I didn't know I could drip sweat. It was hot, and they sleep in that at night. That's where they sleep. They sleep on mattresses that are disgusting, mattresses that don't have any foam to them. I mean, they're just thin. They have outhouses to bathe in. They have outhouses to use the restroom in. When it rains, those flood, and they flood where they use the restroom. They're paid. They're mandated to be paid a certain wage, but they don't always get that wage. And they also have to pay for their food and their toiletries. And there is regulation that they can provide them food, but they don't always provide them food. So what they get has to last them a really long time. And these workers are scared to leave because they came on an H-2A visa, which means they're tied to the farmer and that land where they're at. So as soon as they walk away, they become an illegal citizen or an illegal resident in the United States, and they could be deported. They have, I think it's 48 hours to get back, I think it is, to their home country, or to get back to the property, or they'll be, or they could be arrested and deported. And so a lot of times we've seen that they've had to sign over their homes for collateral back in their home countries, and if they leave, they lose their home. Or they even have potential sometimes to have harm brought to their family if they don't fulfill their work duties. So that's just kind of a picture of labor trafficking. And it can happen differently. There are migrant farm workers that come here and do not get treated like that.
And I think it's also important, what we've learned as we've looked into this more is that often the farmer and the grower is completely naive to this process, because they often use kind of a middleman or a contractor, called farm labor contractor, to help get the work done and help oversee the crew there. And so they're actually paying the farm labor contractor the right amount and spending quite a bit of money actually, but the farm labor contractor is not always transferring that to the guest worker that's here and is not always following that. And so we've learned that there are other states that have a certification process statewide for farm labor contractors, and they're able to monitor this better. And it's one of the things the commission has kind of put on our list to look into and learn a lot more about, because we've learned that a lot of our actual farmers and growers are being exploited by this too. So we just have kind of been diving in and learning more about what that life can look like in farm labor.
What about from a sex trafficking? If you're comfortable speaking of it.
I'll say, I want to note this too, like, it looks different for every person, right? So to tell you what it looks like, for the life of somebody in the life is really hard, because I never have two clients come into our program who have a story exactly the same. So I think that's really important to note. We can give you an overview of what it might look like, but it's gonna look different for everybody. Do you want to give an example, Christine?
Sure. I think it's important to think about, so, you know, you can have, let's say, a situation of a young teenager or an 18, 19-year-old even that sometimes this happens through opioid addictions, you know, through someone that has become addicted to an opioid, or maybe even a boyfriend or someone else kind of got them addicted to heroin or opioid, and then they're so addicted that they continue to seek that drug through whatever means. And so often we'll see someone that is trafficked by who they thought was a boyfriend, but is really their dealer and their pimp, and they continue to do it to avoid that withdrawal that's so horrible from opioids. So we see that. We see teenagers that go to school every day and have been tricked into this, you know, through being groomed on apps or social media, and a lot of the things out there that can happen where someone slowly isolates them from their family and kind of tricks them. It can happen through tricking them through a photo, like, well, send me a photo of you wearing this, or you wearing nothing, and this photo goes through Snapchat, but is then used as blackmail. You know, I'm going to send this to everyone in your school. I'm going to put this out across your social media, and if you don't do what I want you to every weekend. And so it can be a teenage boy or girl that functions normally going to school, and you know, you would see kind of your normal mood changes in that you see in so many teenagers already. So I think that it really can look different, and I think you've had a good picture of illicit massage and what that can look like. I'm trying to think of other examples, but we know.
I mean, we have recently actually had two different women, and I want to also note this happens to men too. Okay,
Yeah,
so this
boys
is just not a
and men.
women's business here. This happens to men and boys. And I've heard of it happening as young as 3 months old, and we've had clients as old as 68, so it doesn't discriminate there. But we have had a client recently who came from another state under the impression she was meeting somebody, and I don't even remember what the meeting was about, but it had nothing to do with any kind of sex act. And she basically was somehow coerced into performing sex acts and was held for several days until she could get away. So it can happen pretty easy. I mean, you know, the internet now makes things so much easier to communicate with people. I've heard of people going, you know, these online dating things, and you meet people and it just goes awry. But you know, I think it's important. It is really not taken. You're not typically abducted into a van and like taken off, and you're trafficked all of a sudden. Like, that's not normally how we see it happening. It is a really slow grooming process. And if you know anybody that's gone through domestic violence, you would understand that their you know, partner was not abusive the day one they started dating. It happened over a course of time, and that's how traffickers really work. They start that over a course of time. So I think that's important to note too. It's really not day one. But we do have a lot of young teenagers who just think that they're in love. He's my boyfriend, he loves me, he cares about me, he gets my hair done, he lets me get my nails done. You know, he buys me Michael Kors bags or whatever kind of bags they want. And they're convinced that they're in love. And those are probably our hardest cases, because it takes a really long time to convince them that they are not in love. And they're the ones that go back multiple times and then come back and be like, okay, I was wrong. But yeah, so.
I want to add too, there hasn't been a lot of research done on human trafficking, but I think a few of the vulnerabilities that are backed up by data are that runaways and homeless youth are particularly vulnerable. Kids who've survived childhood sexual abuse are particularly vulnerable. And kids who have, at some point in their life, have or will interface with the child welfare system are particularly vulnerable. And then I think of the undocumented community. And they have a particular vulnerability because they do not have legal status here in the U.S. And lots of people have figured out lots of ways to take advantage of that. And also, I think it's worth noting that, you know, sometimes I think the media often portrays a picture of a victim as, you know, you'll see like the I don't know, blonde, blue-eyed little girl, and she can be a victim. But many victims have had a really rough life. And sometimes they have a criminal record that's longer than that of their trafficker. and that doesn't make them any less worthy of access to services and help to get back on their feet and rebuild and restore their lives. And I am just continually amazed by the resilience and the resolve and the bravery of the individuals who we have the honor of working with at Justice Matters. It's really, really a privilege. And one, I guess one issue that I think we do need to tackle as a state is this issue of victim-defendant duality, that someone can be a victim and also a defendant. So we've served clients who, as we were helping them get their T visa, they were also being prosecuted federally because traffickers know that someone with a criminal record is less sympathetic to us and will often get, and to law enforcement. And when you get, when you have a victim in a massage business, why not, make her book the appointments? And then, you can tell her if you run to law enforcement, you're gonna get charged too. Or we see situations of forced drug addiction. So traffickers will get victims addicted to illegal drugs so that they can maintain that power and control over them. I don't know if that's something you want to speak more to, Chief, but I think that's something that as a state we're starting to become more aware of.
Sure. Detective Smith and I were actually talking about this the other day. We recognize that there is an extraordinary experience that these folks have undergone, and we can't even begin to understand it sometimes, and we want to be sensitive to that. Taking a victim-centered approach sometimes can be hard, especially when you know that the person that you're also dealing with has been involved in a number of crimes, a number of different types of crimes, and it can be very difficult to sometimes find and strike the right balance between getting this individual the help and the resources they need, communicating a message that they have value and worth as a human being, and at the same time trying to take a hold of the leverage sometimes that the criminal justice apparatus affords us by being able to hold on to that individual, be able to get more information out of them that may lead us to some of these other folks who are involved in these illicit activities. And it's as I said, it's a difficult balance to strike, and many of them, if they already have, as you mentioned, if they already have lengthy criminal records and they've already been conditioned to believe that interaction with law enforcement is going to result in something worse than what they're already facing and dealing with, that becomes an extraordinary challenge for us. This having been the first time that we ever dealt with something like this in Knightdale, we felt it extraordinarily important to address things from the victim-centered approach, recognizing, yes, there had been crimes that had been committed, yes, there was a level of accountability that we didn't want to summarily ignore, but at the same time, what's more important in the moment? And for us, much of it was a learning experience, and I think we learned a lot about how we were viewing things that we need to be conscious of in taking the victim-centered approach in this process. And I'm confident that as governmental organizations like the police departments and investigative units continue to work with non-governmental entities, we'll get to a place where we're able to strike that balance. But at the end of the day, this job, this profession, law enforcement's always been about other people. It always will be. And I think us addressing it in that manner early on was the right way to do it. And I think as long as we have that type of mindset, we'll find the right balance eventually.
And I just want to say, y'all are really fortunate to have a police department that values that. We don't see that across the state of North Carolina. And working with Detective Smith and the guys that day, they were nothing but victim-centered with these ladies. We've done other massage parlor outreach, and I can guarantee you it was not victim-centered. We actually had to be like, hold up, we're leaving, or you gonna treat them this way? So we can't say enough about how much we appreciate that they were victim-centered and that they called us in. We don't always get a yes, we wanna leave. We don't always get a yes, I wanna stay here. I want all these services you have to offer, but we plant a seed, and we firmly believe in Project Fight if we can at least plant that seed of hope and of education. You know, these are your workers' rights, and these are the things that you have that you can pull from, and this is who you can call if you need help, that one day they might turn around and be like, I need help. So we really do appreciate y'all taking that victim-centered approach, because it does take a lot of work. It's not easy to call us in and have us invading your space while you're doing an investigation, and we're kind of taking over that person at the moment to do things. So we appreciate that.
Sheila?
I would like for you to share with us, once a victim has been taken from the place, what type of haven are they given?
Yeah, so we actually, and I'll speak kind of like what we do as far as direct services. So we actually have a 24-hour hotline where we will respond and provide rescues for individuals across the state. So if we get called, we will go pick them up as long as law enforcement's involved, just for our safety. We do have to look out for that. But then we have shelters that we work with across the state. In Raleigh, we're fortunate we have some housing that we're able to use. We have partners that we work with, though, if we don't have enough bed space. We always take into consideration the safety of, you know, is there trafficker here? Are they still on the streets? What that looks like. We do a lot of safety planning with them in the first couple hours to make sure that they're safe. And then, you know, beyond that, we're looking at, and then in the first probably week, 72 hours to a week, we're looking at what do they need to really start that recovery. In Project Fight, if they're staying in our shelter, we tend to say the first 30 days they do nothing but rest. We don't want them working, and a lot of times they're ready to work because they just want something to keep their mind off of it. But we want them to rest and sleep. There's a lot of trauma in those first days that they're really coming down off of. They can't sleep with the lights off. You know, a lot of things are triggers that to us would not seem like a normal thing to bother you, but it really does trigger them. So we try to let them really just recuperate and start the counseling process and medical process. So that's typically what it looks like. It can look a little different depending, but even law enforcement's pretty respectful with not interviewing right away. We work really closely with Raleigh PD. Of course, it's a larger jurisdiction, so we get a lot more referrals from there, but they're really respectful in that person's come out of a really traumatic situation, and we don't want to ask questions right away. They ask the important ones they have to have, and then they're like, we'll come talk to you in a couple days. So law enforcement's learning that and really respectful with that.
And there are a number of rapid response teams, or we call them regional response programs. Salvation Army leads a number of those, including the one that covers the Triangle. And Justice Matters is honored to be a part of that, and also very glad we are not a first responder, frontline responder. When individuals have had a chance to have their basic needs met and reach a point of more stability, then they come in and meet with us as lawyers so we can help assess their legal needs. And there are behavioral health providers, sort of the whole medical providers, a number of professionals who are part of those regional response teams.
Do you have a number? So you would, general public would call,
The hotline.
yeah, the national hotline. Or if it's like an immediate danger thing that you think's happening right away, I mean, we always say call 911 or.
Please do.
Yeah, we say don't call the national hotline. Yep. I mean, if you see something that's happening like right then that you're like, we need somebody here right away, don't ever try to step in, number one. A lot of people, they're like, can I step in and say, well, no, don't ever try to say anything, just call the police.
So to follow up to that, absolutely. If you don't know who to call, if you don't know what the resource is, please call us, because one of the things that we've been able to do through this experience is establish a list and a relationship with the resources that are available. And you know, you may not necessarily think that this is a job that the police should be tasked with doing, but in reality, our job is about finding people in crisis and figuring out how we get them in a place, out of a place, so that crisis is no longer something that they are dealing with. And while we will probably not be leading efforts from the point of contact afterwards, it's wholly appropriate that we be called into a situation, particularly if it is rapidly evolving. Let us get there. Let us, establish a a safe scene, so to speak, and then we will initiate the process of reaching out to the appropriate resources if you don't know exactly who to call.
You can also
It's
always
alright.
call the National Human
Yeah.
Trafficking Hotline.
Yeah.
And what they'll do is they'll take a report. So we get reports all the time of, this is a tip. Somebody just saw something suspicious, but there's like nothing immediate to it. And then we forward it on to the appropriate jurisdiction. So,
Yeah,
if you
and
wanna
I
share
would
that
say,
number.
I do have that number, and so the National Human Trafficking Hotline is 888-373-7888. And if you Google National Human Trafficking Hotline, if you do an internet search, it pops up right away, that tip line. And they're 24/7. They have people available in like 200 languages. And so what's really good about the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and as a state, we really do promote that number because of their ability. They have a text line as well. But if you're even not sure, because a lot of times when this happens, when, a month from now when you're somewhere and you think, you don't know for sure. And so they're very good as well with walking you through questions to ask or things to do, or this is a number you could give to someone, like, hey, if something's happening to you, if you're being forced to do something that you don't want to do, call this number. Things like they are good in all of those situations and route it back to North Carolina if there needs to be immediate action. So we do tell people that number as well, because they have all of those tips and resources and other questions to ask that can just walk you through things.
And it can be anonymous. You don't have to give your name if you don't want to. I myself have called and reported things to the national hotline. You don't have to give your name. You can if you want. Of course, that does make investigating it a little bit easier when you're willing to talk to them, but you don't have to. So sometimes we get very vague tips that have no detail to them whatsoever, and we're like, well, we can't do much with this. So if you leave us a number, we always can follow up.
Other questions? Anybody want to?
I have a question. As a consumer that likes to support local, like I think about all our nail salons and things like that here, what inspection processes are in place do they look for those types of things and those types of salons to try to prevent labor trafficking during inspection process?
Yeah, now we are in the process actually of trying to get in and do some training with inspectors and on that level. And there has been some things done on a statewide level or county levels even with inspectors, but not widespread enough. And so it's definitely something the commission has on our list. We in 2016 focused a lot on law enforcement efforts and were able to help get a mandatory training for all law enforcement across the state to try to kind of bring everyone up to the same place. And then last year, we've done a number of symposiums over the past 3 years, but we do try to target some of that as well. There's a big movement now with nurses and healthcare industry to educate, and a lot of material coming out, but no material specifically yet on inspectors. So it is something on our list.
But I think going to nail salons, like, do your nail technicians change all the time? Are they consistently the same nail technicians when you go in? That's something to look at. I have no shame to ask my nail technician how they get paid. I will say, how do you get paid? Do you get paid by the hour, or do you get paid a percentage of what I pay? I have no qualms with that whatsoever. I know some people might feel uncomfortable, but I don't. My nail salon knows I work in anti-human trafficking, and I'm paying attention to what they're doing. I don't care. And all of my staff do the same thing. We go to places we know, we've asked them a list of questions. We're just a little crazy like that, though. But yeah, do the people change, rather often? And again, are they staying open late? One thing too, when you go to these massage parlors and nail salons, if they're living there, you'll often see clotheslines out back where they're hanging clothes to dry. That's not normal at a normal business. You're not hanging your clothes out back to dry. So those would be things to look for too.
And at restaurants. And I think part of that is, strike up a conversation with your waitress or with, the people that you're interacting with on a daily basis. You just never know.
I mean, I did it for my Christmas tree this year. I was like, how do y'all harvest these Christmas trees? Who plants your Christmas trees? I don't care. I do it everywhere. I do it at the farmer's market, and I will straight up walk away from your stand. There's a certain thing they tell me, and I'm gone. But I don't care to ask, because I want to make sure, like you said, that my money's going to somewhere, right, where people are being paid fairly and treated fairly. And And so I think, especially nail salons, we do know that they'll move you rather often. That happens in massage parlors. The same women don't stay there very long. Massage parlors, you're probably not going to walk in those anyways because they are a little different. You're going to know it right when you walk to the door. Doesn't look like Massage Envy. Doesn't look like Hand and Stone foot massage. It looks different. So, yeah.
Yep.
How many of the Johns get prosecuted for purchasing the services?
As many as we can find. I don't recall specifically how many customers we ended up identifying during our roundup. That's something that's very important to us in terms of holding them accountable. You heard the statements a little bit earlier. This sort of thing exists because there's a demand. And if there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. And so it seems simple enough, just simply get rid of the demand and you can get rid of the supply. But unfortunately, that is not the case. I certainly don't want to wax philosophical here, but I do believe that there is evil in this world, and as long as evil exists in this world, there will be people who are engaged in things and activities that will take advantage of people who are vulnerable, and those folks are going to be extraordinarily manipulative, capitalizing on the fears of these individuals, whatever those fears may be, whether it's a threat of jail time, whether it's the threat of a loss of a home, whether it's the threat of disappointing someone back home, whatever it may be, there's fears and vulnerabilities, as these ladies have already mentioned, that folks are trying to capitalize and manipulate on. And I see a John who goes in for these types of services, not as an individual who is engaging in a legitimate business transaction, but as an individual who is further perpetuating that vulnerability, that manipulation, and that fear. And so it is extraordinarily important for us to make sure that we do everything that we can to hold them accountable. They're contributing to this issue through the demand.
And you'd be surprised how blind even the Johns are to the human trafficking side of it. There are some websites out there with some blogs that these mongers get on and follow these massage parlors and escort services, and they rate them. And they say, so when we did some things here in Raleigh and Knightdale and Cary, there was a lot of things on there about this isn't human trafficking. These ladies, they're here on their own accord. They're making good money. They were happy to see me. They're oblivious to them being trafficked. Their mind is go in there and take care of themselves. They don't care about them. They don't put a face, and they're not a human being to them. Even they are oblivious to what's happening. And some of them, we've opened some eyes. When I talk to some of these gentlemen, they really didn't pay much mind. Like I said, they were self-centered when they were going there to get what they wanted, and that's as far as it went within their mind.
And I will add, in North Carolina, mistake of age is not a defense. So, you can't get away with saying, well, I didn't know she was a minor. If she's a minor, that's a crime. And consent. A minor cannot consent
Correct.
to be involved in commercial sexual exploitation.
Yeah.
That is.
And we have young people in our community. We have 1,700 teenage students a day here in Knightdale at the high school, not to mention our middle school and our elementary schools, 4 elementary schools. I've had some interaction with some young ladies and young men at our high school that have been a part of this trade involuntarily and unknowingly. And some of them have been rescued out of it, and some of them are still in the clutches of it. But it exists, like they said, anywhere and everywhere. And we get kids from all over the county in Raleigh to come here. Our students at the high school aren't just Knightdale kids; they're Raleigh kids. They're kids in the county: Rollsville, Wendell, Zebulon.
I just moved here from Zebulon, so don't say anything about Zebulon. But I was wondering about the drug issue, if that's still getting worse, or is it backed off and something else has taken its place?
So I think that there are always emerging trends and issues in the law enforcement community, and you don't have to, well, if you've been around over the last couple of years, you know the issue that we are dealing with right now on a national level with the opioid epidemic, and I think that we're only going to continue to see a rise in that sort of thing, and again, a couple of years ago, as this thing was kind of cropping up in other places, we weren't seeing as much of it here in Knightdale as you may see in other areas. And what we've noticed, and what my colleague, Chief Guffey in the fire department could attest to, is the increased number of overdose calls that we are now seeing, that we are now responding to. And certainly with an industry like the illicit drug trade, I think there's probably some connection that you're always going to see between it and these other types of illicit activities. Anybody that's ever been in the grips of an addiction and has overcome an addiction can attest to the power of its grip, and can attest to the things that an individual will do, will go through, will put themselves through and others through, just to feed that addiction. One of the things that I tell people all the time, and take some comfort in this, folks, Knightdale is a community that has a relatively high quality of life, and we have a, comparatively speaking, a relatively low level of crime, especially violent crime. We are not a community that is untouched by crime, and we see our fair share of things, and having worked in other jurisdictions, and Detective Smith can attest to this as well, it is not this way in every community. And I was having a conversation with Sheila just before we got started, and I continue to be amazed at the number of groups that are actively working in their own way to try to make sure that this community remains one that has a high quality of life and a relatively low level of crime. But as long as those things exist, as long as there are emerging trends, as long as there are exigencies, if you will, that continue to crop up, we're eventually going to see some of our share of that. And as a community that is continuing to grow, as a community that is in the shadow of a large metro area, it is going to be the case that we see that from time to time, but I'm a firm believer that how we respond to that, how attentive we are to those things, will be the determining factor in how much they ultimately impact our community.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Patty, well, this will be our last one, then we'll wrap it up.
My son passed away a year and a half ago from opioid, okay? And, my niece passed away 5 months later. My niece was a heroin addict. And, she, was caught up with a friend of hers who
many times in our own neighborhoods, we do not know who our neighbor is. And we've got to break those barriers to be able to know who you are, who am I, build a relationship for that.
Thanks, Shannon. Two things before we wrap up. I think this kind of follows the statement that was just made. What are the long-term lasting impacts of victims of human trafficking? Do we know? And maybe there's not enough research to really point to that. And then the next question is from the citizenry. You guys represent 4 very different organizations. What can we do to support your organization? So if there's a way to speak to the long-term impacts.
I can speak to that briefly. I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I'm sure everyone in here has heard of trauma. And every victim has survived trauma, and there is a lifelong impact of that.
And I think too, when we talk about long-term impacts, I mean, we can look at human trafficking from a lot of different angles, because this is a crime that takes everyone to really address it and end it and fight it. And so you can look at this from public health aspects of what human trafficking is and the long-term effects of that. You can look at it from the crime aspect, from the social justice aspect and trauma aspect. And in reality, we know the long-term effects of even just kind of the idea of buyers thinking that it's okay to go into a place and buy this service because that's what they want, even though it's illegal. I mean, even that kind of moral direction of things, I think the impacts are huge for us not to address it.
Yeah, I mean, working directly with survivors every day, I mean, we definitely see the impact. I know I have colleagues who are survivors, and one of them posted just the other day on Facebook, I wish people could understand how deep trauma really is. And she's been out of the life for years, but she still is affected by trauma. So I don't think any of that ever disappears. I don't think it disappears for the family. I think the family still feels that level of guilt. I could have done something different, or why didn't I notice, or what could I have done more? I think those lasting effects are long term, and it affects our community too. We desensitize ourselves. We have men going to, not that women don't do it, because women purchase it too, but we have people going in to purchase sex. We have people, we just went to a thing about porn this afternoon, people watching porn and making porn. All that just totally, affects society, and it affects people in society, that we don't have these feelings that we should have as normal people, the way God created us. So I think those lasting impacts come in so many different ways, but for survivors, those don't ever go away. I think there's always those triggers, those certain things that happens, and instantaneously you're taken back to that moment that you were in your situation. I don't think it ever ends for them. You can come to a certain point in your journey, right? And you can live day to day without those thoughts every second, but there's still those moments that it feels impossible.
So how can we support the Salvation Army's Project Fight initiative?
Yeah, so I always hate to say it, but we always need financial support. It does take dollars to support these ladies and to provide the services that we provide. I didn't say at the beginning, but we provide everything literally from the moment of rescue till their moment of restoration back on their feet. So every need in between, we're kind of helping to provide for them. We do have a Facebook page that is linked to an Amazon wish list. So there's always things we're updating on there that we need. Prayer, we definitely need to be covered in prayer. And our staff deal in here with a lot every single day. This last week alone, we took in 13 clients. That is a heavy week. Our normal week is 1 or 2. We took in 13. So there's days that are really, really long, and that we go home and we sleep and lay awake in bed, thinking about these things. So covering them in prayer, we hear a lot of stories that are really hard to hear. So educate other people. Share what you learned tonight with other people. We're happy to come out and do education programs, do presentations, Human Trafficking 101. We do youth programs. We're happy to come out and do anything like that at your business. We're happy to come wherever you work and do that, other churches. Just spread the word. and stay in your kid's business. Don't be the parent who thinks I'm in their business too much. If I had a kid, and God bless me to not have one in this job, because I would be all up in their business and I'd be the worst parent ever. I see kids at the mall walking around and I'm like, they're too young to be walking around the mall. My dad's like, they look like they're 16. I'm like, they're too young to be walking around the mall. I just can't do it. But just, keep your eyes and ears open and do talk to other people about it, because I think this is a topic that people are scared to talk about it because it's easier to pretend it doesn't exist than that it does. And so don't be afraid to share, this information with others. But those are just some small ways you can support us. And then you can always reach out specifically if you're interested in other ways. We are growing our volunteer program this year. We'll be doing some labor outreach at some labor camps in the eastern part of the state this summer. So if you're interested in participating in that or other activities that we have for survivors, I have cards up here and be happy to talk to you further.
Thanks.
I have a business card right here. You can come get it at the end. Yep.
Chief, how can we support the police department?
The first thing that I would tell folks to do is this. Do not adopt the mindset that if you call us, you are wasting our time because we have bigger things that we should be doing, and this is an emergency, or this doesn't really feel like a 911 issue. That is not true. If it is important to you, if it feels like something that is urgent to you, if it's something that's out of the ordinary for you and your community, your neighborhood, call us. We're a team of 35 men and women serving a population of 16,000 folks, and that's growing. And those 35 men and women are divided into different shifts, different assignments, different roles, and it is impossible for us to be everywhere and to see everything and to be aware of the things that are sometimes going on in your neighborhood. You are the subject matter expert in your neighborhood, in your subdivision, or at least you should be. And that would be the next thing that I would encourage you to do, is to know your neighborhood, know your community, know the people there, know the comings and the goings. Be good neighbors, be good to one another. And that way when you see something that doesn't quite look right, you'll know that it's the right time to pick up the phone and to call us. As I said earlier, I'd rather send my folks out and spend a minimal amount of time and determine that an issue is nothing than to have to invest an extraordinary amount of time and resources on the tail end of something and know that it could have been prevented. You are not wasting our time. We welcome your call. We welcome your visit. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. As we said, it's a little cliche, but if you see something, say something that's important to you. We want to make it important to us. And I think as long as we continue to make community partnerships and relationship building a driving force behind our mission of the police department, then you'll always have a good police department here in Knightdale. So again, call on us. We're here. We are here to serve. It is about other people. So you're not wasting our time. Please know that.
Thanks. Libby, how can we support Justice Matters?
I echo much of what Elizabeth shared, and we'll say that we are grateful the government is reopening because we had funding tied up, Victims of Crime Act funding. And payroll's tough when your grants aren't coming in. I think the best thing that you can do for Justice Matters is work us out of a job. And I have a few ideas for that. Thank you for sharing your story. I don't know your name, and I'd love to talk to you after this, but I just affirm that. Look out for your kids and look out for others' kids. And I always encourage people, consider being a guardian ad litem volunteer. Consider fostering. Work with the foster care system. Consider adopting. Consider tutoring, after-school tutoring. Teachers are they're really on the front lines of human trafficking prevention. Support your schools, support teachers in your community, get involved. There are so many ways that I think each of us, we are not law enforcement. We will not be breaking down the doors.
I would if I could, though.
Please don't. Call Chief Caps.
When we do hotel operations, I'm like peeking out the window. I'm like, did they get him yet? Did they get him yet? Sorry, Libby.
And there are limited volunteer opportunities for those of you with experience working with trauma. You know, it's not healthy. As much as all of us would love to, you know, walk alongside them and get to know them, that can be really overwhelming and re-traumatizing to them. So I think there often are limited volunteer opportunities with victim service agencies. So I point people to prevention. And then just to take stock in, you know, all the gifts, skills, resources, expertise you have. We are so blessed. If you're in this room tonight or watching on Facebook, we are just so blessed. We have so many resources. And I would bet that if I sat down and talked to you for 5 to 10 minutes, we could figure out a good way for you to invest your professional and personal experience and expertise in combating human trafficking. And I do have a challenge for the church, actually. I should have talked to you about this beforehand, but I love the program Darkness to Light. And I think it's a great way for people to kind of take the next step in combating human trafficking. I think the YMCA of the Triangle might still be
They do the training.
facilitating this training, but I think it's essential training for every adult in the community to have, in every church. So Darkness to Light is about preventing child sexual abuse. And you know, I thought I knew a lot, but sitting through this program, my eyes were open in so many ways. It's a phenomenal program, and it is so relevant and so applicable to anyone who ever engages with kids. And so I would encourage you to do that. Yeah, it's free.
Thanks, Libby. Human Trafficking Commission, how can we support?
Well, you already are. So I would say definitely by hosting events like this, by coming and learning and listening, that it helps raise the awareness and spread the truth about what's happening and educate. You can always go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline Resource Center websites and learn more about human trafficking. I have some business cards as well that I can put you on an email list that the commission has of our meetings and you know, different initiatives that we have going on. Sometimes those are legislative type initiatives, sometimes they're just training and awareness type of things or new material that we might recommend. And we have a website as well that you can find information on. But really getting educated and being a part of the overall movement and saying something when you see something is helping us. So.
And supporting public officials who take action on this. I mean, I know everyone's budget is stretched, and there's so much to do, and we do have limited resources. And so, you know, supporting Chief Caps and your local police department, it's, again, I salute you. Yeah. And thank you. And call your legislators. The legislature has passed human trafficking related legislation in the past 2 sessions, and the commission, just putting on my chair hat for a second, is going to be voting on legislation that we will be proposing this session. So follow that, encourage that. Lord willing, it'll go through, and you can call them and thank them for supporting that.
I have 8:30 exactly. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you guys so much for sharing tonight.
Thank you for having us.
What?
Thank you for having us.
Oh, absolutely.
It's an honor
And
to be here.
they may be hanging around for a little bit. I know Chief Caps has got a resource that's available out.
Just one more thing, folks. Out in the lobby, we brought some publications called Shadow Victims. This is just a very simple publication item. It's out in the lobby. Please feel free, if you're family represented here, to grab one of these. There's just some very useful information in here to help educate yourself. And then when you're educated, educate someone else.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Have a great night.
Where'd you get that from?
You can have that. So, yeah, absolutely.